Krabat by Otfried Preussler, the third year. Chapter 1. The King of the Moors. The master did not reappear for several days, and meanwhile the mill stood still. The miller's men lay on their beds or sat by the warm stove. Had there ever been a journeyman called Michael who worked at the mill in the fen? Even Merton never spoke of him. He never spoke at all. He sat there from morning to night, saying nothing. Only once, on the evening of New Year's Day, when Juro brought up the dead man's clothes and laid them at the foot of the empty bed, did he wake out of his trance. He ran out to the barn and hid in the hay until morning. Ever since that he had been utterly listless, seeing and hearing nothing, saying and doing nothing, just sitting about. These days, Krabat's thoughts kept circling around the same tormenting questions. It seemed plain that Tanda and Michael could not both have died by chance, both on New Year's Eve. What game was being played and who was playing it? And what were the rules? The miller stayed away until the eve of Twelfth Night. Vitko was just about to blow out the light when the attic door opened, and the master appeared on the threshold, pale as death. He cast a glance around, but he did not seem to notice Michael's absence. "To work," he ordered them. Then he turned, and was not seen again that night. Hastily, the men dressed and hurried downstairs. Pitar and Stashko ran to the mill pond to open the sluice. The others stumbled into the grinding room, tipped out the grain, and set the mill grinding. It began to go around, rattling and clattering, and the miller's men felt their hearts lift. The mill is grinding again, thought Krabat, and life goes on. They finished work about midnight, and when they came into the attic, they saw someone lying on Michael's old bed. A boy of about 14, who looked small for his age. The lad had a sooty face and very red ears. Full of curiosity, the miller's men surrounded him, and Krabat, who was holding the lantern, shone it on him. At that, the boy woke, and when he saw the 11 ghosts standing by his bed, he was frightened. Krabat felt sure he had seen him before. When could it have been? "No need to be afraid of us," he said. "We're the miller's men, and we work here. What's your name?" "Lobosh." "What's yours?" "I'm Krabat. And this is—" The sooty-faced urchin interrupted him. "Krabat. I once knew someone called Krabat." "Did you? But he'd be younger than you." Light dawned on Krabat. "You must be little Lobosh from Malkendorf," he cried. "And you've blackened your face to play the part of one of the 3 kings from the east." "That's right," said Lobosh. "And for the last time, too. I'm apprentice to the miller here now." He said this full of pride, and the miller's men kept their thoughts to themselves. When Lobosh came down to breakfast next morning, he was wearing Michael's clothes. He had tried to scrub the soot off, not entirely successfully. There were still traces around the corners of his eyes and his nose. "Never mind," said Andrush. "A morning in the meal store will clean that off." The boy was hungry, and he wolfed down his oatmeal. Krabat, Andrush, and Stashko, who were sharing the same dish, were amazed at the amount he could eat. "If you work as well as you eat, the rest of us can take it easy," said Stashko. Lobosh looked at him, a question in his eyes. "Ought I to eat less?" "No, no, eat all you want," said Krabat. "You need all the strength you can get. No one need go hungry here." But instead of spooning up more oatmeal, Lobosh put his head on one side and studied Krabat. His eyes narrowed. "Why, you might be his big brother," he said. "Whose big brother?" "That other Krabat's, of course. You remember, I told you I knew someone else called Krabat, whose voice was just breaking, eh? He left you in Gross Partwitz." "How do you know?" asked the bewildered Lobosh. Then he struck his forehead. What a silly mistake to make. he cried. Why? At the time, I took you for maybe a year and a half older than me, 2 years older at the most. I am 5 years older than you, said Krabat. At that moment, the door opened, and in came the master. The miller's men shrank back from him. Hmm? Said he, going up to the new apprentice. You talk too much. You'd better get out of the habit of that. He turned to Krabat, Stashko, and Andrush. He's to eat his breakfast, not chatter. Get that into his head. And the master left the servants' hall, shutting the door behind him. Suddenly Lobosh seemed to have had enough. He put down his spoon, hunched his shoulders, and sat there with his head bent. When he glanced up, Krabat nodded to him across the table only very slightly, but the boy seemed to understand. He knew that he had a friend at this mill. Lobosh, in his turn, had to spend a morning in the meal store. The master came for him after breakfast. Why should he have an easier time than the rest of us? Said Lishko. A bit of flour won't hurt him. Krabat said nothing. He was thinking of Tonda and Michael. If he wanted to help Lobosh, he must not make Lishko suspicious, even over the smallest matters. Just now there was nothing he could do for the boy. Lobosh would have to get through the morning as best he could, wielding his broom amid clouds of flour dust. His eyelashes stuck together, his nose clogged up. There was no help for that. He must manage somehow. Krabat could hardly wait until Juro called them in to dinner. While the others made their way to the servants' hall, he ran to the meal store, shot back the bolt, and flung the door open. Come on out, it's midday, he said. Lobosh was crouching in a corner, his knees drawn up, his head in his hands. When Krabat called to him, he jumped. Then he came toward the door, slowly, dragging the broom behind him. He jerked a thumb over his shoulder. I couldn't do it, he said in a very small voice. So after a bit, I just stopped and sat down. Do you think the master will send me packing? There'll be no reason for him to do any such thing, said Krabat. Uttering a magic spell, he traced a pentagram in the air with his left hand. Thereupon the dust in the room rose up as if the wind were blowing it from every nook and cranny. It sailed out of the door like a plume of white smoke over Lobosh's head and away in the direction of the wood. The room was swept clear. There was not a speck of dust left. The boy opened his eyes wide. How did you do that? He asked. Krabat left the question unanswered. Promise not to tell a soul, said he. Now let's go in, Lobosh. Our soup will be getting cold. That evening, after the new apprentice had gone to bed, the miller summoned his journeyman and Vitko to his room, and they admitted Vitko to their company just as Krabat had been admitted on 12th night the year before, according to the rules of the mill and the custom of the guild. Hanzo and Petar vouched for Vitko to the master, and then the red-headed boy was declared free of his indentures. The master touched his head and shoulders with the blade of the hatchet. In the name of the guild, Vitko, Andrus had an empty flour sack waiting in the hall. As soon as the master dismissed them, they popped it over Vitko's head, took the newly made journeyman miller off to the grinding room, and there put him through the mill. Gently with him, Hanzo warned them, don't forget how thin he is. Thin or not, said Andrush, a journeyman miller is no feeble little tailor. He must be able to stand up for himself. Come along, brothers, let's get on with it. In accordance with their usual custom, they gave Vitko a thorough working over. But Andrush told them to stop sooner than he had last year, when it was Krabat's turn. Peter took the sack off. Stashko scattered flour over Vitko's head and declared that he had been through the mill. Then they seized him and tossed him in the air 3 times, after which he had to drink a toast to them. Your health, brother. Here's to you. The wine was no worse than usual this 12th night, yet the miller's men could not really manage to feel merry, and that was Merton's doing. He had worked in silence all day, eaten his meals in silence. He stood by in silence while they worked Vitko over, and now he sat on a meal bin, stiff as a post, taking no interest in the proceedings, and there was nothing at all, that could persuade him to break his silence. "Hey there," said Lishko. "You look as if you had a nasty smell under your nose." Grinning, he held out a full tankard to him. "Get drunk. Why don't you, Merton? Just spare us that glum face of yours." Merton got up. Without a word, he went up to Lishko and struck the tankard out of his hand. The two men stood facing each other, eye to eye. Lishko began to sweat. The others held their breath. It was quiet in the room, quiet as the grave. Outside in the passage, they heard a soft tapping that hesitated and then came closer. All of them, Merton and Lishko included, looked at the door, and Krabat, who was nearest to it, opened it. Lobos was standing on the threshold, barefoot, in his shirt, a blanket around his shoulders. "Hello. So it's you, is it, Your Majesty?" said Krabat. "Yes, it's me." "I was frightened all alone in the attic," said Lobos. "Aren't you ever coming to bed?" Chapter 2. The Way You Fly with Wings. Everyone took to young Lobos right from the start. Even Merton was kind to him, though he showed it without words, by a nod of the head, a glance, or a gesture. Merton was cutting himself off from his companions more and more. He did his work. He went through the day's routine. He did not seem to be sulking, nor did he object to anything the master or the head journeyman told him to do, but he would not speak. He never spoke at all, not to anyone. And he preserved this silence he had imposed on himself since New Year's Day, even on Friday evenings, when the master read to them from the Book of Necromancy. The master was undisturbed. "It's up to you how hard you work to learn the secret arts, as you know," he said to his men. "It's all the same to me." Krabat worried about Merton, and he felt he ought to try to talk to him. One day soon, he, Petar, and Merton happened to be sent to the granary to turn the grain. They had hardly started when Hanzo came to fetch Petar away to the stable. "Carry on by yourselves. I'll send someone else up as soon as there's a man free," said Hanzo. "Right," said Krabat. He waited until Hanzo and Petar had left, closing the door behind them. Then, putting his grain shovel down in the corner and placing a hand on Merton's shoulder, he asked, "Do you know what Michael once told me?" "The dead are dead," said Krabat. He said it twice, and the second time he added, "Those who die at the mill in the fen of Kosel are forgotten as if they had never been. That's the only way the others can go on living, and life must go on." Merton had listened quietly, and now he took Krabat's hand, which was still lying on his shoulder, removed it in silence, and went on with his work. Krabat was at a loss. What was he to do about Merton? Tonda would have been able to advise him, perhaps Michael too, but now Krabat was on his own, and it was not so easy. He was glad Lobos was there. The boy fared like all the other apprentices before him, and he could hardly have stood his first few weeks at the mill, but for Krabat's help, and Krabat did help him. He knew how to contrive it so that they met from time to time at work, not too often, as if it happened by chance. Then he would stop and exchange a few words with the boy, put a hand on his shoulder, and following Tonda's example, let his own power flow into him. He had learned how to do this one Friday evening. "But mind you don't let anyone notice," he impressed upon Lobos. "Take care the master doesn't learn of it, or Lishko either. He carries tales to the master." "Aren't you allowed to help me?" Lobos asked. "What if someone finds out?" "Never mind that," Krabat answered. "The main thing is not to give yourself away. Young as he was, Leboche got the point at once. He played his part with considerable skill, and only the two of them knew that he was pretending for the benefit of the others, and things were not really quite so bad as his pitiful grunts and groans suggested. Every evening he went straight to bed after supper, hardly able to crawl up the attic stairs. Every morning, even at breakfast, he looked as tired as if he was about to fall off his chair any moment. Leboche was a bright lad and an excellent play actor, and more, besides, as Krabat found 2 weeks later when he discovered Leboche hacking away at a great mound of ice behind the mill. "There's something I wanted to ask you," the boy began. "Will you answer me?" "If I can," said Krabat. "You've been helping me since I came to this mill," said Leboche, "and you've kept on helping me, even though the master's not to know because he'd be angry with you if he did. That's plain enough. Anyone can work that out." "Is that what you wanted to ask me about?" Krabat interrupted. "No, I'm just coming to the question," said Leboche. "Well, what is it?" "How can I pay you back for all your help?" "Pay me back," replied Krabat. He was about to dismiss the subject when he thought better of it. "One day," he said, "I would like to tell you about my friends Tonda and Michael, who are both dead. If you will listen to me then, that will be payment enough." About the end of January, a thaw set in, as violent as it was unexpected. Only the day before, the fen had been frozen hard. Now the west wind was blowing around the house, and had been since the early hours of the morning, far too warm a wind for the time of year. The sun shone, and within a few days, most of the snow had melted. A few dirty gray remnants were left here and there, in a ditch or a hollow or the ruts of a cart track. But what were they beside the brown of the fields, the dark of the molehills, the first hint of green under last year's withered grass? "This is like Eastertide," said the miller's men. As each day passed, the warm west wind affected them more and more, making them feel heavy, tired, and fidgety. They slept restlessly, dreamed confused dreams, and talked in their sleep. Sometimes they would lie awake for hours, tossing on their beds. Only Merton never moved, but lay motionless on his straw mattress, and he did not talk even in his sleep. Krabat thought about the singer from Schwarzkolm a great deal at this time. He decided he would speak to her at Easter, which was still some time off, however. His mind was full of the thought of where he would go to see her, and how he would stop to talk to her. These last few nights he had dreamed 2 or 3 times that he was on his way to see the girl, but never reached her. Each time something happened to stop him, and later he could not remember what it was. What was it? What was it that stopped him? He could remember the beginning of the dream quite clearly. He had seized his chance to run away from the mill unobserved. He did not take the usual way to Schwarzkolm, but chose the path across the bog, along which Tonda had once led him on their way home from the peat cutting. Up to this point, everything was clear, and then he could not remember the rest. It tormented him. One night, as he was lying in bed, wakened by the howling of the wind, he was trying to puzzle it out again. Doggedly, he went over the start of the dream in his mind, a 3rd time, a 4th time, a 6th time, until, in so doing, he fell asleep, and this time he did succeed in dreaming his dream to its end. Krabat has run away from the mill, seizing his chance to slip out of the house unobserved. He is making for Schwarzkolm to see the singer, but he does not take the usual way. He chooses a path through the bog, the path along which Tonda once led him when they were coming home from the peat cutting. Out in the bog, he suddenly becomes unsure of himself. Mists have gathered, and he cannot see through them. Hesitantly, Krabat gropes his way forward over quaking ground. Has he strayed from the path? He feels the bog sucking at the soles of his feet. He feels himself sink deeper in at every step he takes to the instep, then to the ankles, then halfway up his calves. He must have wandered into a patch of quicksand. The harder he tries to find his way back to firmer ground, the faster he sinks in. The bog is cold as death, glutinous, sticky, and black. He feels it closing around his knees, his thighs, his hips. Soon he will be entirely swallowed up. While his chest is still free, he begins to shout for help, though he knows there is not much point in it. Who would hear him out here? Still, he shouts and shouts at the top of his voice. "Help!" he cries. "Save me! I'm sinking, save me!" The mist has grown thicker, and so it happens that Krabat does not become aware of the two figures until they are within a few paces of him. He thinks he recognizes them as Tonda and Michael. "Stop!" he cries. "Stay where you are. There's a dangerous patch here." In the mist, the two figures merge into one. How strange. The solitary figure throws him a rope with a piece of wood tied to the end of it. Krabat catches it, clutches the piece of wood, and feels the figure pull him out of the bog and onto firm ground. It all happens very fast, and now Krabat is standing by his rescuer's side. He tries to thank him. "Never mind all that," says Juro. And only now does Krabat see that it is Juro who helped him out. "If you want to go to Schwarzkolm another time, you'd do better to fly." "Fly?" asks Krabat. "How do you mean?" "Why, the way you fly with wings." And that is all the answer Juro makes before the mists swallow him up. "Fly," thinks Krabat. "The way you fly with wings?" Why did he never think of that for himself? At once he changes himself into a raven, as he is used to doing every Friday night, spreads his wings, and rises into the air. With a few wing beats, he soars up above the mists and makes for Schwarzkolm. Down in the village, the sun is shining, and below him he sees the singing girl standing at the lower of the two village wells, a straw basket in her hand, feeding the chickens. Then a shadow falls across him. He hears the cry of a hawk in his ear. There is a rushing and a whirring, and at the very last moment he turns sharply to the right. Missing him by a hair's breadth, the hawk pounces on empty air. Krabat knows his life is at stake. Swift as an arrow, wings spread, he swoops down. He lands beside the girl, scattering the chickens. Once on the ground, he turns back to human form. He is safe now. Blinking, he looks up at the sky. The hawk is gone, vanished. Perhaps it has changed course. Then suddenly, the master is standing by the well. He is angry. He stretches out his left hand for Krabat. "Come with me," he snarls. "Why?" asks the girl. "This young man belongs to me." "Not so," she says. Just 2 words, but she speaks them in a voice that allows of no question. Putting her arm around Krabat, she wraps him in her shawl of wool. It is soft and warm, like a cloak of safety about him. "Come," she says. "Come away." And they walk away together without a backward glance. Chapter 3. An attempted escape. The next morning they found that Merton had disappeared. His bed was stripped. The blankets lay neatly folded at its foot. His working smock and apron hung in the press, his clogs standing under his stool. No one had seen him go. They did not notice his absence until he failed to come in to breakfast. Baffled, they searched the mill for him, but he was nowhere to be found. "He's run away," said Leshko. "We must tell the master." Anzo barred his way. "That's my job as head journeyman," he said. "Or is that news to you?" They all expected the master to fly into a rage when he heard the news of Merton's disappearance. and they were waiting for shouts, curses, and imprecations, but nothing of the kind happened. At dinner, Hanzo told the others that the master seemed to take it lightly. All he had said was, "Merton's crazy." And when the head journeyman asked what was to be done, he replied, "Let him be. He'll come back of his own accord." When he said that, he winked. Hanzo told them, and that wink was worse than 1,000 curses. I turned so cold inside me I thought I'd freeze to solid ice on the spot. Let's hope Merton's all right. "Huh," snorted Lishko. "Anyone who runs away from this mill must know what he's in for." "Well, Merton has a broad back, broad enough to carry a load of trouble." "Oh, do you think so?" asked Juro. "To be sure I do," said Lishko, and he brought his fist down on the table to emphasize his words, whereupon the soup in the bowl splashed up into his face. He let out a yell, for the soup was thick and boiling hot. "Who did that?" cried Lishko, wiping his eyes and cheeks. "Which of you went and did that? One of the other journeymen must obviously be responsible." Stupid Juro was the only one who merely seemed bothered by the waste of good soup. "Better not bang the table another time, Lishko," said he. "Not quite so hard, anyway." Merton came back that evening, as dusk was falling, just as Krabat had feared. He stood in the doorway silently, his head bowed. The master came out to meet him, in front of all the other journeymen. He was not angry with Merton. Instead, he mocked him, asking how he liked his little expedition, and why he was back so soon. Didn't he like it in the villages, or what? "You don't want to tell me, eh, Merton? You haven't opened your mouth for weeks, have you? But I'm not forcing you to speak. You can run away again for all I care. Try it. Try it. As often as you like. Only don't set your hopes too high, Merton. You're not the man to do what no one has ever done yet." Merton did not flicker an eyelash. "Well, make believe if you want," said the master. "You didn't get away, but you don't mind, eh? We know better. I and the 11 of them." And he pointed to the journeyman and Lobosh. "We all know better. Now get out." Merton crept up to bed. The miller's men were all unhappy that evening, except for Lishko. "We must persuade him not to try running away again," said Hanzo. "You try," said Stashko, "if you think it will do any good. I don't." "No," said Krabat, "I doubt if he'll listen." Overnight, the weather changed, and when they went out of doors next morning, it was bitterly cold, without a breath of wind. There was ice on the window panes and ice on the rim of the trough under the pump. The puddles around it were covered with ice. The molehills were frozen stiff, and the ground was hard as bone. "It'll be bad for the winter sowing," said Petter. "No snow, and now this frost. A lot of the seed will be spoiled out there in the fields." Krabat was glad to see Merton appear at breakfast with the others and attack his bowl of oatmeal greedily, obviously making up for yesterday. Then they went to work, and no one noticed Merton slip away from the mill again. This time in broad daylight. It was not until they came in for dinner at noon that they realized he had gone once more. Merton was away for 2 days and 2 nights, longer than any runaway had ever managed before, and they were just beginning to hope he had safely made his escape, when he came stumbling across the meadows toward the mill on the morning of the 3rd day. He was exhausted and blue with cold, and there was a dreadful look on his face. Krabat and Stashko went to meet him at the door and led him inside. Peter took one of his shoes off, Keto the other, and Hanzo told Juro to bring a bowl of ice-cold water. He put Merton's frozen feet into it and began to rub them. "We must get him to bed as quick as we can," said he. "I hope he's going to be all right." While the men were busy tending Merton, the door opened and the master came into the room. He stood watching them for a while, but this time he refrained from mocking. He waited until they were about to take Merton upstairs. "Just a moment," said he. Going up closer to Merton, he told him, "I think twice should be enough for you, Merton. There is no road for you that leads away from here. You will never escape me." That very morning, Merton took the third and, as he thought, the final way out. The miller's men guessed nothing. They had taken him up to the attic, tipped a hot drink down his throat, wrapped him in blankets, and put him to bed. Hanzo stayed with him, sitting on the next bed watching until he was convinced Merton had fallen asleep and did not need him any more. Then he went down to join the others at work. Stashko and Krabat had been busy for several days, dressing the millstones. They had finished 4 pairs of stones, and today was the turn of the 5th. They were just about to loosen the cramp so as to get at the stones, when the door to the grinding room was flung open, and Lobos burst in, white-faced, his eyes wide with terror. He was gesticulating and shouting. He seemed to be shouting the same thing again and again. The miller's men could not make it out until Hanzo stopped the machinery. It was quiet in the mill then, and only Lobos's voice could be heard. "It's Merton. He's hanged himself," he cried. "Merton's hanged himself. In the barn. Quick, come quick." He led them to the place where he had found Merton. Merton was hanging from a beam at the far end of the barn, a halter around his neck, looking as if he were staring at them. "We must cut him down." Stashko was the first to realize that Merton was still alive. "Quick! We must cut him down." Androsh, Hanzo, Petar, and Krabat. Everyone who had a knife snapped it open, but none of them could manage to get anywhere near Merton. He seemed to be surrounded by a magic circle. They could take just 3 steps toward him, but not an inch more. After that, their feet seemed to stick to the ground. Taking the point of his knife between thumb and forefinger, Krabat aimed, threw, and struck the rope. He hit his mark, but the knife fell to the ground, powerless. Then someone laughed. The master had entered the barn. He did not so much as glance at his men. He paid them no more attention than if they were dirt. He bent to pick up the knife and cut the rope. There was a thud. Limp as a sack of grain, the hanged man fell to the ground and lay there at the master's feet, a rattle in his throat. "You bungler!" There was contempt in the master's voice. He dropped the knife and spat on the ground in front of Merton. Every one of the men felt as if the master had spat at him, and they were sure that what he said was meant for all of them. "I decide who dies at this mill," cried the master. "No one else decides for me." He went out, and then they could attend to Merton. Hanzo took the noose from his neck, and Petar and Stashko carried him up to bed. Krabat picked up Tanda's knife from the ground. Before putting it back in his pocket, he rubbed the handle carefully with a wisp of straw. Chapter 4. The Winter Wheat. Merton was sick, and he was sick for a long time. He ran a high fever at first. His throat was swollen and his breathing was difficult. He could not swallow a morsel of food for some days, though later he managed to get down a spoonful of soup now and then. Hanzo had arranged for one of the men to be somewhere near Merton all the time during the day, never letting him out of sight. For some time they kept watch over him by night as well, fearing that in his fever he might try to harm himself again. In his right mind, they all agreed even Merton would not try the rope again, or indeed try taking his own life by any means at all. The miller had left them in no doubt that there was no escaping from the mill in the fen that way. "I decide who dies at this mill." The master's words were imprinted on Krabat's mind. Weren't they the answer to that question he had been asking himself ever since last New Year's Eve? Who was to blame for the deaths of Tanda and Michael? When he thought it all over, he saw that what he had was still only a clue. No more, but no less, either. At all events, he would have to call the master to account one day when everything was cleared up. That, he thought, was as good as decided. Until that time, he must not draw attention to himself. He must act like a good, harmless fellow, an obedient journeyman with no idea of what was going on. Yet all the time he must be preparing himself for the day of reckoning. And so he must work doubly hard at his studies in the secret arts. No snow fell these February days, but the frost was as severe as ever. The miller's men had to climb down into the tail race every morning to hack away the ice, and they kept cursing the cold that had followed the untimely spring weather. One day soon, about midday, 3 strangers came out of the wood and walked toward the mill. One of them was tall and strong, a man in the prime of life, while the other 2 were wrinkled, white-bearded old men. Lobos was the first to see them. His eyes were quick, and nothing much escaped them. "We're about to have visitors," he called to his companions, who were just sitting down to dinner. They all saw the 3 men coming along the path from Schwarzcombe. They were dressed like farmers, wrapped in shepherd's cloaks, their winter caps pulled well down on their foreheads. No farmer from the nearby villages had ever found his way out here to the mill in the fen, not since Krabat had been working there. But these 3 went right up to the mill and knocked at the door. Hanzo opened it to them, and the other men crowded into the hall full of curiosity. "What do you want?" asked Hanzo. "We want to speak to the miller." "I am the miller." Unnoticed by his men, the master had come out of his room. He went up to the farmers. "Well, what is it?" The tall man took off his cap. "We're from Schwarzcombe," he began. "I'm the mayor there, and these are our village elders. We bring you greetings, and we want to ask you to listen to us. Miller. It's because of... I don't suppose you'll be surprised to hear." The master cut him short with an impatient gesture. "Come to the point. What brings you here? No beating about the bush, if you please." "We want you to help us," said the village mayor. "How do you mean?" "This frost, and there's no snow on the fields." The mayor twisted his cap in his hands. "The winter wheat will spoil if we don't have snow soon." "What has that to do with me?" "We wanted to ask you to make it snow, Miller." "Make it snow? What gave you that idea?" "We know that you can do it," said the village mayor. "You can make snowfall, and we're not asking you to do it for nothing," one of the old men assured him. "We'll pay you 60 eggs, and 5 geese, and 7 chickens." "You must make the snow fall," said the other old man, "or else we'll lose all next year's harvest, and then we'll go hungry. And our children, too," added the mayor. "Take pity on us. Miller, make the snow fall." The master stroked his chin with his thumbnail. "I've not seen hair nor hide of you in all these years, but now you need me. Here you come, all of a sudden." "You're our last hope," said the village mayor. "If you will not send us snow, we're lost." "You can't refuse to help us, Miller. We ask you on our bended knees as if you were the good Lord himself." The 3 of them kneeled down before the master, bowed their heads, and beat their breasts. "Hear our prayer," they begged him. "Hear us." "No." The master spoke sternly, no pity in his voice. "Go back home." "What do I care for your winter wheat? I and my men here." And he pointed to the journeyman. "We won't have to go hungry, not us. I can see to that. And without snow, if need be. As for you, peasants, don't come pestering me with your eggs and your poultry. You can die for all I care. That's your affair. I've no intention of lifting a finger for you and your brood. Come, Do you seriously expect it of me? What about you? The village mayor turned to the miller's men. Won't you help us, either, kind sirs? Do it, for the sake of God's mercy, for our poor children. We will reward you. Well, I'll set the dogs on him. Hey there. He put his fingers to his mouth and gave a shrill whistle, a sound that pierced the listeners to the marrow. The barking of dogs could be heard, many angry dogs, yapping and yowling. Dropping his cap, the village mayor leapt to his feet. Come on, he cried. They'll tear us to pieces. Run! He and the two old men snatched up their shepherd's cloaks and ran out of the mill, across the meadows, and disappeared into the wood, the same way they had come. Well done, said the master. Well done, Lishko. He clapped him on the shoulder. We're well rid of those three, and they won't be back in a hurry, you can be sure. Krabat was furious. He felt sorry for the village mayor and his companions. What harm had they ever done the miller for him to deny them his help? It would have cost him no more than a glance at the book of necromancy, and the recital of a few words, just those few words necessary in this case. And they were words that Krabat did not know. The master had not yet taught his men how to make snow fall. That was a pity, for otherwise Krabat would have helped the farmers himself without a second thought. Peter would probably have done the same, and Hanzo, and a number of the others. Lishko was the only one who was glad the miller had turned the farmers away, and proud of his own success in tricking them into thinking there were dogs after them. However, his glee did not last long. The following night, Lishko suddenly woke with a loud cry, and when the others asked what on earth the matter was, he told them, his teeth chattering with fright, that he had been dreaming of a pack of furious black hounds attacking him, about to tear him in pieces. Dear me, said Juro sympathetically. What luck it was, only a dream. That night Lishko dreamed of the fierce hounds 5 times more, and 5 times more he woke screaming and wakened the other men. In the end, it was more than they could stand, and they turned him out of the attic. Take your blanket, Lishko, and go off to the barn, they told him. You can dream of hounds all you like there, and shout yourself hoarse, so long as we don't have to listen. The next morning the men rubbed their eyes and looked twice before they could believe it. Everything was white outside. Snow had fallen during the night, and it was still snowing, big, fleecy snowflakes. They went on, falling halfway through the morning. The snow would gladden the hearts of the farmers in Schwarzkolm and the other villages around the fen, had the master relented and helped them after all. Maybe Big Hat had a hand in it, said Juro. The farmers might have met with him, and I don't suppose he'd have refused them. Big Hat, said the others. Why, no, Big Hat wouldn't have refused them, to be sure. Yet it could not have been Big Hat after all. For about midday, and once again, it was Lobosch who saw them coming about midday, the village mayor, and the elders of Schwarzkolm drove up to the mill in a horse sleigh, bring the master what they thought they owed him for his help. 7 chickens, 5 geese, and 60 eggs. Our thanks to you, miller, said the mayor, bowing low to the master. Our thanks for taking pity on our children. You know we're not rich folk, but take what we bring as a token of our gratitude, and may heaven reward you. The master heard him out, an expression of annoyance on his face. The journeyman could see how hard he had to struggle to keep his self-control as he replied, I don't know who it was that helped you. It wasn't I, at all events, and let there be no doubt about that. Put that stuff back on your sleigh and go to the devil. With these words, he turned his back on the farmers and went into the black room, and his men heard him bolt the door on the inside. There stood the village mayor and his companions with their presents, baffled and dumbfounded. Come, said Juro, helping them reload the sleigh. "You just go back to Schwarzkopf, and when you're home, have a drink or two and forget all about it." Krabat watched the sleigh with the three men until it disappeared into the wood, and for a while after that he could still hear the sound of the bells, the crack of the whip, and the voice of the village mayor shouting, "Gee up," to his horses. Chapter 5. My name is Krabat. The snow melted, spring came, and Krabat was studying like a man possessed. He had long since outstripped his companions. The master praised him and showed that he was very pleased with his progress in the black art. He did not seem to guess that Krabat was studying and studying and studying so as to be prepared for the day of reckoning. On the fourth Sunday in Lent, Merton got up for the first time and went to sit in the sun behind the woodshed. He had grown pale and thin, almost transparent, and they could see that his neck was permanently crooked. However, he was speaking again now, just the barest necessities. Yes and no, give me that, or leave it alone. On Good Friday they admitted Lobosch to the black school, and the boy was much surprised when the master turned him into a raven. He flitted perkily about the room, brushing the skull and the book with the tips of his wings. The master had to give the command 3 times before the young imp would settle on the perch. He was a comical black bird with bright eyes and ruffled feathers. This is the way to speak to another in thought, so that he will hear and understand the words as if they came from within himself. The miller's men found it hard to follow the master that evening. Lobosch kept distracting them. It was amusing to watch him roll his eyes, crane his neck, and flap his wings and never mind what the miller was reading from the book of necromancy. But Krabat did not let a word escape him. He realized how important this new lesson was, important for himself and the girl from Schwarzkopf. He impressed the spell upon his mind, syllable by syllable, and as he lay in bed, before going to sleep, he repeated it again and again until he was quite sure he would never forget it. On Easter Saturday, at dusk, the master sent his men out again to bring back the sign. When he counted them out, Krabat and Lobosch were left till last, and the miller dismissed them with his dark blessing. Krabat had put blankets ready in the woodshed, 2 each, for the sky looked dark as evening came on, and there was a smell of rain in the air. Since they were the last to leave the mill, he urged Lobosch to hurry in case any of the others might already be on their way to Beaumail's End. But when they reached the wooden cross, his fears proved groundless. They collected twigs and pieces of bark from the edge of the wood and kindled a small fire. Krabat told the boy why they were sitting out here and how they must spend the night keeping watch by the fire together. Shivering, Lobosch wrapped himself in his blankets. A good thing I don't have to sit here on my own, he thought. I'd probably die of fright, and then maybe they'd have to put another wooden cross up here, a smaller one. Later, they talked about the black school and the rules whereby they were instructed in the magic arts. Then they were silent for a time, and at last Krabat began to speak of Tonda and Michael. I said I would tell you about them one day, he reminded Lobosch. And as he talked to Lobosch about his friends, he realized that he himself was now in Tonda's place, at least so far as this boy opposite him on the other side of the fire was concerned. At first he did not intend to tell Lobosch anything about the deaths of Michael and Tonda, or at least no details. But the longer he talked of the 2 of them, and of Vorschula, who lay buried inside Winkle churchyard, and how Tonda said that the men who worked at the mill in the fen would always bring a girl bad luck the longer he talked, the more he felt that the boy had a right to hear what he had meant to spare him. So in the end, Krabat told him everything there was to be told, except that he did not mention the secret of his knife blade. He feared that might endanger its magic power. "Do you know who is guilty of Tonda's and Michael's deaths?" asked Loboche. "I have a very good idea," said Krabat. "And if I am proved right, then I'll get even with him." At midnight, a light rain began to fall. Loboche pulled the blanket over his head. "Don't do that," said Krabat. "You won't be able to hear the bells and the singing in the village." Soon after that, they heard the pealing of Easter bells in the distance, and the voice of the singer from Schwarzkolm came over the fields, alternating with the voices of the other girls. "It sounds pretty," said Loboche, after a while. "It's worth getting wet to hear that." The girls sang, the bells rang out. Krabat did not even notice when the rain stopped. For him, at this moment, there was neither rain nor wind, warmth nor cold, light nor dark. There was nothing in the world but the singer, her voice, and the memory of the way her eyes shone in the light of the Easter candle. Krabat had decided he would not go out of himself again this time. The master had taught them the way to speak to another in thought, so that he can hear and understand the words as if they came from within himself. As morning approached, Krabat recited the new spell, directing all the power he could summon up toward the singer until he believed he could feel that he had reached her. Then he spoke to her. "There is someone here begging you to listen to him, singer," said he. "You don't know him, but he has known you a long time. When you draw the Easter water this morning, fall behind the other girls on the way home. You must walk alone, carrying your pitcher. That someone wishes to meet you in secret, because this concerns only you and him, and no one else in the world." He repeated this speech earnestly 3 times, always in the same words. Then day began to break, the singing and the bells fell silent. Now it was time for him to teach Loboche to draw the pentagram, and for them to mark the sign on each other with splinters from the cross. Krabat cut them from the upright with Tonda's knife and charred them in the embers. Krabat was in a great hurry on the way home, as if he were determined to be the first back at the mill. With his short legs, Loboche could hardly keep up. Just before they reached the fen, among the first of the bushes, Krabat stopped. He searched his pockets, then struck his forehead and cried, "I must have left it by the cross. My knife. My knife. The one Tonda gave you." Yes, Tonda's knife. The boy knew that Tonda's knife was the only keepsake Krabat had of him. "We must turn around and go back for it," said he. "No, no," said Krabat, hoping that Loboche would not see through his ruse. "I'll run back alone. It'll be quicker. You'd better sit down here and wait for me." "If you think so," the boy stifled a yawn. "Yes, I do." While Loboche sat down in the damp grass between the bushes, Krabat hurried back to the spot that, as he knew, the girls would have to pass taking the Easter water home, and hid in the hedge there. It was not long before they came up the road in a long line with their pitchers. As they passed, Krabat saw that the singer was not among them. So she had heard and understood his request. When the other girls were all gone, he saw her coming by herself. Wrapped tightly in her shawl, he came out of his hiding place and went to meet her. "My name is Krabat, and I am a journeyman miller. I work at the mill in the fen," he said. "Don't be afraid of me." The girl looked into his face calmly, as if she had been expecting him. "I know you," she said. "I have dreamed of you. Of you and of a man who means you harm, but we took no notice of him, you and I. I have been waiting to meet you ever since, and now you are here." "Yes, I am here," said Krabat. "But I can't stay long. They expect me back at the mill. And I must go home, too," said the singer. "Will we meet again?" Then she dipped an end of her shawl in the pitcher of Easter water, and without a word she wiped the pentagram off Krabat's forehead, quite gently, taking her time, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The young man felt as if she had wiped some taint from him, and he was filled with gratitude to her, just for being alive and there with him, looking at him. Chapter 6. Living in a Dream. Lobosch had dropped off to sleep among the bushes on the outskirts of the wood, and when Krabat woke him, he stared at him drowsily. "Did you find it?" "What?" "The knife, of course." "Oh, the knife. Yes," said Krabat. He showed the boy Tanda's knife, snapping out the blade. The blade was black. "You ought to rub it down and grease it," Lobosch suggested. "Yes," said Krabat. "That's what I ought to do." Then they hurried homeward, meeting Vitko and Juro halfway. They had been at Dead Man's Cross and were late back too. "I wonder if we'll get there before the rain starts," said Juro. As he spoke, he looked at Krabat, as if he saw something odd about him. The pentagram. If he came back to the mill without the sign, the master was bound to be suspicious. Then both he and the girl might be in danger. Krabat searched his pockets for a piece of charcoal, but he knew there wasn't any there. "Come on," Juro urged him. "We'll pay for it if we don't hurry. Let's run." At the moment that the young men left the wood and ran for the mill, the storm broke. A gust of wind tore the caps from Vitko's and Krabat's heads, and heavy rain beat down, making Lobosch cry out. By the time they reached the mill, they were all drenched. The master was waiting impatiently. They bowed under the yoke and received his blows on the cheeks. "Where's the sign? In the devil's name," he cried. "The sign?" asked Juro. "Why, there," and he pointed to his forehead. "I can't see anything there," said the master. "Why?" "Then the rain has washed it off." The miller hesitated and seemed to be thinking. Then he ordered, "Lishko, get me a piece of charcoal from the hearth and hurry." Roughly, he retraced the pentagram on all four foreheads just above the nose. The touch burned their skin like fire. Now to work. They had to toil harder and longer than usual that morning. It seemed an age to the four of them before the mark was gone from their foreheads. But at last it was over, and suddenly little Lobosch found he could lift a full, heavy sack above his head. "Hooray," he cried. "Look how easy it is. Just see how strong I've grown." The miller's men spent the rest of the day celebrating, eating Easter cakes and drinking wine, singing and dancing. There were tales told, tales of Big Hat among them, and Andrush, getting a little merry, made a speech, the gist of which was that all journeymen were jolly good fellows, and all master millers should be sent to the devil. "Let's drink to that," cried he, "unless anyone here disagrees." No, they all shouted, raising their tankards, but Stashko protested. "What be sent to the devil?" he cried. "No, no. Satan can come and fetch away all the master millers for himself. May he wring their necks, everyone." "Right you are, dear brother," Andrush embraced him. "Right you are. May the devil fly away with all millers, starting with ours." Krabat had chosen a place in the corner, near enough the others for no one to be able to say he wouldn't join in, and yet he was not really one of them. He kept on the edge of the merrymaking, and while the other young men laughed and sang and made boastful speeches, he was thinking of the singer from Schwarzkopf, and how she met him that morning on the way home, and how they stood and talked to each other. Krabat could remember every word she spoke, every movement and glance of hers, and he could have spent hours sitting in his corner thinking of her, never noticing how time was passing, if Lobosch had not sat down on the bench beside him and nudged him. "Can I ask you something?" "Well?" asked Krabat, trying not to sound impatient. Lobosh was looking worried. Those things Andrush was just saying, and Stashko, suppose they come to the master's ears. Oh, as for that, said Krabat, that's just silly bragging, couldn't you tell? But the miller, replied Lobosh, if Lishko goes to tell him, what will he do to Andrush and Stashko? He won't do anything to them at all. Oh, you don't mean that, cried Lobosh. He'll never stand for that kind of thing. Why, yes, today he will, said Krabat. Today we may abuse the master and wish every kind of plague on him. We may wish him at the devil, as you've just heard, and he won't bear us any ill will today, on the contrary. Why not? Asked Lobosh. Because if you can get your grievances off your chest once a year, said Krabat. Why? Then you'll do what is asked of you all the better for the rest of the time, and as you will find out, a great deal is asked of you at the mill in the fen of Kossel. Krabat was no longer the Krabat of former days. For the next few weeks, he was living in a kind of dream. He did what had to be done. He talked to the other men. He answered their questions, but really, he was far away from all that went on at the mill. He was with the singer, and she with him, and the world around was growing brighter and greener every day. Never before had Krabat noticed how many kinds of green there were, 100 varieties of grass green, the green of the birch and willow trees, moss green here and there, a tinge of bluish green, the young tender green on the banks of the mill pond, on every hedge, in every bramble bush, and the dark, muted evergreen of the pines out in the fen, which were often bloomy, even ominous looking, almost black, yet now and then, especially toward evening, shone as if they were rimmed with gold. A few times, though not too often, Krabat dreamed of the girl by night as well. The main features of his dream were always the same. They are walking together in a wood or a garden where old trees grow. It is warm, summer weather, and the girl wears a pale smock. As they walk among the trees, Krabat puts his arm around her shoulders. She bends her head, and he can feel her hair on his cheek. Her kerchief has slipped back on her neck a little, and he wishes she would stop and turn to him, because then he could look into her face. But at the same time, he knows it would be better if she does not do so. Then no other person could see her face. Too, no other person who might have the power of sharing his dreams with him. Krabat's companions noticed that something had happened to change him, and once again it was Lishko who tried to sound him out. It was the week after Easter. Hanzo had given Krabat and Stashko the job of dressing one of the millstones. They had put it by the door of the grinding room and were busy with their mill bills, deepening the grooves running outward from the middle of the stone. They went carefully, stroke by stroke, so the edges would be sharp. At one point, Stashko went away to sharpen his bill, which was blunted, and it took him some time. Lishko happened to come along with a bundle of empty sacks under his arm. Krabat did not notice him until he stopped and spoke to him. Lishko always crept about the place quietly, even when there was no need for it. "Well," said he, with a wink, "what's her name, then? Is she fair, or brown-haired, or dark?" "Who?" inquired Krabat. "Why, the girl who's been on your mind so much lately," said Lishko. "Do you think we're blind and don't notice that someone's turned your head in a dream? Maybe I know a good way to help you meet her. I'm not without experience, you know." Looking cautiously around, he bent down to Krabat and whispered in his ear, "You have only to tell me her name. I could easily arrange it all." "Oh, be quiet, do," said Krabat. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're keeping me from my work, you and your foolishness." Next night, Krabat dreamed his now familiar dream of the singer from Schwarzkolm. Again they were walking among the trees, and it was a warm summer's day, But this time they came to an open space in the middle of the wood, and when they began to cross this clearing, they had not taken more than a few steps before a shadow fell over them. Krabat flung his coat over the girl's head. "We must get away from here. Quick, don't let him see your face." He pulled the girl back into the shelter of the trees, and he heard the cry of a hawk, shrill, piercing, like a knife going into his heart, and that woke him. The following evening, Krabat was summoned to the master. He felt ill at ease as he stood before the miller, and saw the master's one eye fixed upon him. "I have something to say to you." The miller was sitting in his armchair like a judge, arms folded, his face stony. "You know that I think the world of you, Krabat," he went on. "You know you can go farther than most of your companions in your mastery of the secret arts. Yet lately I have had my doubts. Can I trust you? You have secrets from me. You are hiding something from me. Might it not be wiser to talk to me frankly and answer my questions of your own free will, rather than force me to spy on you? Tell me. Now what's it all about? Then we'll think what to do in your own best interests. There's still time." Krabat did not hesitate a moment before answering. "Why, I have no secrets to tell you, master. Are you quite sure?" "Quite sure," said Krabat firmly. "Go, then, and if you find yourself in trouble, don't say I didn't warn you." Juro was out in the hall, and seemed to have been waiting for Krabat. He drew him into the kitchen and closed the door behind them. "Here for you, Krabat." He pressed an object into Krabat's hand. A small, dried-up root on a loop of plaited thread. "Take it and hang it around your neck, or you'll dream such dreams as will get you into a very bad way." Chapter 7. Surprises. For the next few days, Krabat found the master remarkably friendly, always giving him preference over his fellow journeymen and praising him for the most ordinary things, as if to show that he was determined not to bear any grudge. Then, one evening about the end of the second week after Easter, they met in the hall of the house while the others were still at supper. "Ah, Krabat, I'm glad to have a chance to speak to you," said the master. "There are times when a man's in a bad mood, as you know, and he'll let himself say things he doesn't really mean. In short, that talk we had in my room not long ago, you remember it. Well, that was a stupid business. Unnecessary, too, don't you agree?" The master did not wait for an answer, but went on in the same breath. "I'd be sorry if you took all I said that evening at its face value. I know you to be a very good fellow, my best pupil for a long time, and unusually reliable well. You see how I feel." Krabat himself was feeling distinctly uncomfortable. What was the master after? Not to beat about the bush any longer, said the master, "I don't want to leave you in any doubt of my regard for you. I am going to grant you a privilege I have never given any of my pupils before. Next Sunday, I'll excuse you from work and give you the day off. You can go out if you like, wherever you fancy, to Mockendorf, or Schwarzkopf, or Sidewinkle, anywhere you please. And so long as you're back by Monday morning, why, that will be good enough for me." "Go out?" asked Krabat. "What would I do in Mockendorf or some such place?" "Oh, there are alehouses and taverns in the villages where you could pass the time pleasantly and girls to dance with." No, said Krabat. "I've no fancy for such things. Why should I be treated better than my companions?" "Why not?" declared the master. "I see no reason why I shouldn't reward you for your industry and perseverance in your studies of the secret arts. You work far harder than anyone else." The next Sunday morning, when the miller's men were getting ready for work, Krabat prepared to do the same, but Hanzo took him aside. "I don't know what's up," said he, "but the master's giving you the day off. I'm to remind you that he doesn't want to see you back at the mill before tomorrow morning. And he says you know about the rest of it." "Oh, yes," muttered Krabat. "I know about the rest of it, sure enough." He put on his best coat, and while the other men went to work, as they did every Sunday, he left the house. He sat down on the grass behind the woodshed to think. The master had set a trap for him. That was clear, and now he had to see that he did not fall into it. One thing at least seemed certain. He could go anywhere he pleased but Schwarzkopf. He would have liked best just to stay sitting here behind the woodshed in the sun, idling the day away. But that would look too much as if he guessed the master's real intentions. "Very well, then. Mockendorf let it be," he thought. "And I'll give Schwarzkopf a very wide berth, indeed." But perhaps that would be a mistake, too. Might it be wiser not to bypass Schwarzkopf, but go right through it, that being the shortest way to Mockendorf? Of course, he must not meet the singer in Schwarzkopf. He would have to take precautions against such a meeting. He recited his spell, and then spoke to the girl. "Singer, there is something I must ask you," he told her. "I, Krabat, am speaking to you. You must not leave your house today. You must not step outside, whatever happens, and don't look out of the window either. Promise me that." Krabat felt sure the girl would do as he asked. Just as he was about to set off, Juro came around the house with an empty log basket. "Well, you don't seem to be in much of a hurry to get away, Krabat. Do you mind if I sit down here with you for a bit?" He fished a piece of wood out of his pocket and traced a circle around the place where they were sitting, adding a pentagram and 3 crosses, as he did on the occasion of their ill-fated horse-trading venture. "I dare say you're thinking that this has nothing to do with gnats and midges," he remarked. Krabat admitted he had had his doubts before. "What you're doing," said he, "is making sure the master can neither see nor hear us sitting and talking here, however near or far away he is. Am I right?" "No," said Juro. "He could see and hear us, but he won't because he has forgotten us. That is the power of the circle. So long as we keep inside it, the master may think of anything else in the world, but he will not think of you and me." "Not such a stupid notion," said Krabat. "Not so stupid at all." And suddenly, as if he had found the key to a problem, an idea shot through him. He looked at Juro in astonishment. "Then it was you," he said. "The farmers had you to thank for their fall of snow and Lishko for his dream of the fierce hounds. Why, you're not the simpleton we take you for at all, are you? You're only pretending." "Suppose I am," replied Juro. "I won't deny that I'm not quite such a fool as everyone thinks. But as for you, Krabat now, don't be offended. You're more of a fool than you have any idea of." "I am. You still haven't realized just what is going on at this accursed mill. If you did, you'd know better than to study so hard, or at least you'd know better than to show it. Don't you see what danger you are in?" "Yes," said Krabat. "I have a very good idea." "You have no idea at all," Juro told him. Picking a blade of grass, he crushed it between his fingers. "I'll tell you something, Krabat. I've played the part of a fool all these years. But if you carry on as you are now, you'll be the next one at this mill to find out the whole truth. Michael and Tonda and all the others who lie buried out in the waste ground, they all made the same mistake as you. They studied too hard in the black school, and they let the master see it. You know now that one of us must die for him every year on New Year's Eve. For the master," said Juro. "He has made a pact with, well, let us say with the Goodman. Every year he must sacrifice one of his pupils to him, or else he will be taken himself. How do you know this?" "I have eyes in my head, and I can make sense of what I see. And then I've read the book of necromancy. What? You? I'm a fool. As you know, or as the master and everyone else knows. They think me simple, only good enough for the housework. I have to clean and scrub and dust, and sometimes I have to clean the black room. And there the book lies, chained to the table, safe from anyone who could read it. The master wouldn't like any of us to read it. There is much in that book that could harm him if we were to learn it. So you can read, said Krabat. Just said Giraud. And you are the first and only person I have told. Now there's one way, only one, to get the better of the master. If you know a girl who loves you, she could save you. If she will ask the master to let you go, and if she can pass the test he will give her. Test. I'll tell you about it another day, when we have more time, said Giraud. For the moment, there's only one thing you need to know. Make sure you don't let the master know who the girl is, or it will be Tonda's story all over again. Do you mean Vorshula? I do, said Giraud. The master learned her name too soon, and then he tormented her in her dreams until she drowned herself in her despair. He pulled up another blade of grass and crushed it. Tonda found her the next morning. He carried her home to her parents' house and laid her down at the door. It was after that his hair went gray. His strength was all gone, and you know the end of his story. Krabat imagined himself finding the girl from Schwarzcombe drowned one morning, water weeds in her hair. What am I to do? Tell me, he asked. What are you to do? Giraud picked a third blade of grass. Go off to Markendorf, or anywhere else you like, and try to lead the master astray as well as ever you can. As he walked through Schwarzcombe, Krabat looked neither to left nor to right. The girl kept out of sight. He wondered what she had told her family to explain why she was staying indoors. Krabat turned into the village alehouse for a short rest, ate a piece of black bread and some smoked meat, and drank a glass of spirits. Then he went on to Markendorf, sat down at a table in the tavern there, and called for beer. That evening, he danced with the girls, talked nonsense to them, turned their heads, and picked a quarrel with the local lads. Get out of here, you, they cried. When they grew really angry and were about to throw him out by force, he snapped his fingers, and there they were, rooted to the spot, unable to move. You silly sheep, said Krabat. So you thought you'd set about me. You'd better fight each other. At that, such a brawl broke out on the dancing floor as Markendorf had never seen. Tankards flew through the air. Chairs were broken. The young men fought as if they were out of their minds, attacking each other blindly. The landlord wrung his hands, the girls screeched, and the musicians jumped out of the window to save their own skins. Good, very good indeed. Krabat encouraged the young men. Excellent. Give yourselves a good hiding. Keep it up. Now keep going, and it ought to last you some time. Chapter 8. A Hard Task. The next morning the master asked where Krabat had been on Sunday, and how he had enjoyed his day out. Oh, pretty well, said Krabat, shrugging his shoulders. Then he told the master about his visit to Markendorf, the dancing there, and the fight with the village lads. It was good fun, he said, but it would have been far more amusing if he'd had a companion, Stashko maybe, or Andrush, or indeed any of the others. Lishko say, no, not Lishko, said Krabat, risking the master's displeasure. Why not? I can't stand him, said Krabat. You too, the master laughed. Then we feel the same about Lishko. Are you surprised to hear that? Yes, said Krabat. Yes, I'm surprised. The master looked him up and down. His glance seemed friendly, though there was some mockery in it. That's what I like about you, Krabat. You're an honest fellow. You always tell me what you think straight out. Krabat avoided meeting the master's eye. He did not know if he meant what he said. It could equally well be a veiled threat. At all events, he was glad when the miller changed the subject. As for what you were saying just now about taking a companion, remember this. From now on, you can go out on Sundays when you like, or you can stay at home if you prefer. But I am granting this privilege only to you as my best pupil, and that's my last word. Krabat was impatient for a private talk with Juro. Juro, on the other hand, had been avoiding him since their meeting behind the woodshed on Sunday. Krabat would dearly have liked at least to communicate with him in thought. But that particular spell did not work within the secret brotherhood. When at last they did meet in the kitchen, Juro informed Krabat that he must wait a few days for that knife you gave me to sharpen. I'll let you have it when it's ready. Very well, said Krabat. He understood Juro's true meaning. Half a week went by, and then the master had to go away again. Before he set off, he told his men he would be away for 2 or 3 days. The following night, Krabat was wakened by Juro. Come into the kitchen. We can talk there. What about them? Krabat pointed to their companions. They're so fast asleep, a thunderstorm wouldn't wake them, Juro assured him. I've taken care of that. In the kitchen, Juro drew the magic circle with its pentagram and crosses around the table and chairs, and lit a candle, which he placed between himself and Krabat. I've been keeping you waiting on purpose, he began. No one must guess that we are meeting in secret. I told you certain things last Sunday, and I dare say you've been thinking them over. Yes, said Krabat. You were going to show me a way to escape the master, and if I understood you correctly, it's a way I can avenge Tonda and Michael too. It is, Juro told him. If you have a girl who loves you, she can come to the master on the last night of the year and ask him to let you go free. If she passes the test, he will put her to. Then he himself must die on New Year's Eve. Is the test hard? Asked Krabat. The girl must prove that she knows you, said Juro. She must pick you out from your companions and say, this is the man. And then, that's all that is laid down in the book of necromancy. And to read it or hear it, you'd think it was child's play. Krabat agreed unless there was a catch in it. He reserved judgment. Was there a secret phrase in the book, for example? The directions might contain a hidden double meaning. If he only knew just how the words ran. The words are clear and plain, Juro assured him, but the master interprets them in his own way. He reached for the candle snuffers and trimmed the smoking wick. Years ago, when I was still quite new here, there was a journeyman among us, one Janko, who tried to do it. His girl turned up on time, on the last evening of the year, and asked the miller for his freedom. Very well, said the master. If you can pick out Janko, he is free, and you can take him with you, as it is written. Then he led her into the black room, where the 12 of us were sitting on the perch, in the shape of ravens. He made us all put our beaks under our left wings. So there we perched, and the girl was quite unable to tell which was Janko. Well, the master asked her, is it this one, on the extreme right, or that one there in the middle, or one of the others? Take your time, think it over. You know what depends on it. Yes, the girl said, she knew. And so, after hesitating for some time, she pointed to one of us at random, and it turned out to be Quito. And then, ask Krabat. Neither Janko nor the girl lived to see New Year's Day, said Juro. And since then, Tonda was the only one who once meant to try the test, with Vorshula's help, but you know about that. The candle was smoking again, and once more Juro trimmed the wick. There's one thing I still don't understand, said Krabat after a long silence. Why has no one else ever tried to escape this way? Most of the others don't know about it, Juro replied. And the few who do hope from year to year that they will not be harmed. There are 12 of us. And death comes to only one every New Year's Eve. And there's something more at stake, which I ought to tell you about. Suppose a girl passes the test, and the master's power is overthrown. At the moment of his death, all he ever taught us will be gone. At a blow, we'll be ordinary journeyman millers again, and the magic making will all be over. Wouldn't that happen if the master were to die some other way? No, said Juro, and that's another reason why the few who know it put up with the death of one of their companions every year. But you, said Krabat, haven't you done anything about it yourself? I did not dare, said Juro, and I have no girl to come and ask for my freedom. He was playing with the candlestick, holding it in both hands, pushing it back and forth on the table slowly, looking at it as if by so doing he were trying to find out something important. Let's understand each other, said he at last. You needn't make any decision yet, Krabat, or not a final one. But now, at once, we ought to begin to do everything in our power to see that you can make the test easier for the girl, if need be. I can, said Krabat. I'll tell her what she needs to know in her thoughts. That will work. We've just learned to do it. No, it won't work then, Juro told him. Why not? The master has the power to stop it. He did so with Janko, and he'll do so again. No doubt about that. What then? Asked Krabat. During these next months, said Juro, you must try to reach a point where you can oppose the master's will. When we are on our perch, in the shape of ravens, and he orders us to put our beaks under our left wings, you must be the only one who can put your beak under your right wing. If you can act differently from us during the test, you'll show who you are. The girl will know which raven to point to, and then you'll have won. What can we do then? Asked Krabat. Train your will. Is that all? More than enough, as you'll find out. Would you like to begin now? Krabat said he would. Let's suppose that I am the master, said Juro. When I give you an order, you try to do the opposite of what I say. Suppose I ask you to move something from right to left. You move it from left to right. When you're told to stand up, you sit where you are. If I order you to look me in the face, you look away. Is that clear? Quite clear, said Krabat. Good, then let's begin. Juro pointed to the candlestick on the table between them. Take hold of that, he said, and move it closer to you. Krabat put out his hand to the candlestick, with the firm intention of pushing it away from him and toward Juro, but he met with sudden opposition. A strong power reached out to him, working against the power of his own will, and for a moment he was quite paralyzed by it. Then a silent duel broke out between them. On one side was Juro's will, and on the other Krabat's, trying to oppose it, to bend and break its power. He was still determined to push the candlestick away. Away from me, he thought. Away, away. But he felt Juro's will gradually taking over and extinguishing his own. As you wish, Krabat heard himself say at last, and he drew the candlestick obediently toward him. He felt utterly empty and drained. If anyone had told him at that moment that he was now dead, he would have believed it. Don't give up hope, he heard Juro's voice from very far away. Then he felt his friend place a hand on his shoulder, and again, quite close this time, he heard Juro speak. That was only your first attempt. Remember, Krabat. After that, they spent every night the master was out of the house in the kitchen. Taught by Juro, Krabat was training himself to set his own will against his friends. It was a hard task, for both of them, and often Krabat was near despair. "I'll never do it," he cried. "And if I'm to die anyway, at least I don't want her death on my conscience, too. Can't you see that?" "Yes, I see that," said Juro. "But she is not involved yet. You needn't worry which way you'll decide yet. It's more important for us to make progress. If you don't lose heart and give up, you'll see how well we'll be doing by the end of the year. Believe me." Once again, how many times was it now? They set grimly to work. And gradually, late in the summer, Krabat began to succeed now and then. Chapter 9. The Sultan's Eagle. Was the master suspicious of Krabat and Juro? Was he on their track? With Lishko's help, maybe? One evening early in September, he invited his journeymen to drink with him, and when they were gathered around the big table in his room, and every tankard was full, he unexpectedly announced a toast to friendship. Juro and Krabat, taken aback, exchanged glances across the table. "Drink up," cried the master. "Drink up, all of you." Then, telling Leboche to refill the tankards, he said, "Last summer, I told you about my best friend, Jerko, and I told you, too, that it was I who brought him to his death. Now, I will tell you how it happened. It was at the time of the Great War against the Turks. Jerko and I had had to leave Lusatia for a while, and so we parted. I enlisted as a musketeer in the Emperor's army, while Jerko, unknown to me, hired himself out to the Turkish Sultan as a magician. The Marshal of Saxony was in command of the imperial army, and he had led us far into Hungary. We were facing the Turkish army, friend and foe both entrenched in fortified camps, and for weeks on end we would hardly have known a war was going on, but for the occasional skirmishing of raiding parties from both sides, and the firing of cannon into the no-man's land between us to find their range. Then one morning it turned out that the Turks had kidnapped the Marshal of Saxony in the night and carried him off, obviously with the aid of magic. Soon after that, a Turk came riding out to our trenches to negotiate. He said the Marshal was a prisoner in the hands of the Sultan, and if our army would withdraw from Hungary within 6 days, he would be set free. If not, he was to be strangled on the morning of the 7th day. There was great consternation, and not knowing that Jerko was in the Turkish camp, I volunteered to go and fetch the Marshal back. The master emptied his tankard at a draught, signed to Leboche to pour more wine, and went on. Our captain said I was out of my mind, but he passed my offer on to the colonel, who took me to see a general. And this man took me before the Duke of Luftenberg, who had taken the command in the marshal's place. At first the Duke did not believe in me either, but then I turned his staff officers into parrots before his very eyes, and I changed the general into a golden pheasant. At that, the Duke changed his tune. He told me to turn his officers back again at once, and promised me a reward of 1,000 ducats if I succeeded in rescuing the Marshal. Then he had his own riding horses brought out for me, and told me to choose myself one. Once more, the master paused to drink, and once more, Leboche refilled his tankard before he continued. Now, said he, I might simply go on with my story, but I have a better notion. You can live out the rest of the story for yourselves. Krabat will play my own part, the part of a musketeer skilled in magic who is going to rescue the Marshal of Saxony. Now we need someone to be Jerko. He glanced from one of his men to another, looking Hanzo over, considering Andras and Stashko, and at last his eyes rested on Juro. You'll do, said he. You may play Jerko, if you like. Very well, said Juro, shrugging. I suppose someone has to do it. Krabat was not deceived by his friend's foolish grin. It was clear to them both that the master intended to test them in some way, and now it was important to be on their guard and not betray themselves. The miller crumbled some dried herbs over the candle flame, and a heavy, drug-like fume spread around the room. The miller's men felt their eyelids droop heavily. "Close your eyes," the master told them. "Then you will see what happened in Hungary while Juro and Krabat act out the story of myself and Jirko in the Great Turkish War." Krabat felt weariness overcome him, felt himself slowly falling asleep as he heard the master's voice, monotonous and far away. Juro, the Sultan's magician, is in the Turkish camp. He has sworn allegiance to the crescent of Islam. And there is Krabat the musketeer, in his white gaiters and blue coat, standing at the Duke of Luftenberg's right hand, inspecting the parade of horses. Krabat the musketeer, in his white gaiters and blue coat, is standing at the Duke of Luftenberg's right hand, inspecting the parade of horses. He likes the look of a black horse with a tiny white mark on the forehead. From a distance, the mark looks like a pentagram. "I'll take that one," he says. The Duke has the black horse saddled and bridled for him. Krabat loads his rifle, hangs it over his shoulder, and mounts. He trots gently around the parade ground, then puts spurs to the horse and gallops toward the Duke and his retinue as if he intended to ride them down. The officers scatter in alarm, but Krabat sweeps over their powdered white heads, and to their amazement, they see the horse carry him straight up into the air. And that is not all. Horse and rider begin to disappear, dissolving gradually into thin air, until they finally vanish from sight completely, even from the sight of the master of the ordnance, Baron Gallus, who has the best telescope in the Imperial Army at his disposal. Krabat rides up and up to dizzy heights, as other men might ride over a level plain. Soon, he catches sight of the first Turks on the outskirts of a bullet-riddled village. He sees their turbans, bright in the sun. He sees the cannon in position behind their gabions. He sees patrols riding back and forth between the outposts. He himself, however, and his horse are invisible. The Turkish horses blow out their nostrils with fear as he passes. The dogs begin to howl and put their tails between their legs. The green banner of the Prophet is waving in the wind above the Turkish camp. Krabat guides his horse carefully down to earth. Not far from the magnificent tent that houses the Sultan, he sees another rather smaller tent, guarded by some 20 janissaries, all armed to the teeth. Leading his horse, he enters the tent. Sure enough, there is that great warrior hero, the Marshal of Saxony, the scourge of the Turks, seated on a stool, his head in his hands. Krabat makes himself visible, clears his throat, goes up to the Marshal, and steps back in amazement. The Marshal is wearing a black leather patch over his left eye. "What is it?" he asks Krabat in a hoarse voice, a voice like a raven croaking. "Are you in the service of the Turks? How did you get into this tent?" "I am at your service, sir," says Krabat. "My orders are to rescue your excellency. My horse is ready." And the horse, too, becomes visible. "If your excellency has no objection," says Krabat. He swings himself up on the horse, signing to the Marshal to get up behind. Then they break out of the tent. The janissaries are so surprised that they do not lift a finger, and shouting boldly, make way there. Krabat and the Marshal race through the middle of the camp. At the sight of them, even the Sultan's Nubian guards drop their spears and swords. "Hurrah!" shouts Krabat. "Hold tight. Your Excellency." No one dares to bar their way, and already they are at the gates of the camp. They ride out into open country. Then Krabat makes the horse rise in the air. Only now do the Turks begin to fire at them, volleys of shots, and the bullets whistle in the air around them. Krabat is in a cheerful mood. He does not fear the Turkish bullets. If those fellows were going to hit us, they'd have to shoot with something made of gold, he tells the astonished marshal. Bullets of iron and lead will do us no harm, or arrows either. The shots die away. The firing stops. Then the two riders hear a rushing and a roaring sound coming from the Turkish camp and swiftly getting closer. Krabat cannot turn around as they ride through the air, so he asks his companion to look behind them. The marshal says he sees a huge black eagle following them. He is swooping down from high above, the sun at his back, his beak toward us. Krabat recites a magic spell, and great clouds tower up between them and the eagle, thick gray clouds, like a misty mountain range. The eagle plunges on, right through them. There, croaks the marshal. It's swooping down on us. By now, Krabat knows what kind of an eagle it is following them, and he is not surprised when the eagle cries out in human language. Turn back, calls the eagle. Turn back, or you are dead, ma'am. Krabat knows that voice. Where has he heard it before? No time to wonder about that. He makes a sign, and a storm breaks around them, flinging the eagle back, a storm that should sweep him right out of the sky. But it fails. The Sultan's eagle is a match for any storm. Turn back, he calls. Surrender, before it is too late. That voice, thinks Krabat. He recognizes it now. It is the voice of Juro, who was his friend when they were journeyman millers together many years ago at the mill in the fen of Kosel. The eagle, the marshal warns him. He's nearly caught up with us. Suddenly Krabat recognizes the voice croaking in his ear as well. Your gun, musketeer. It is urging him. Fire. Why don't you shoot the monster down? Because I have nothing made of gold. Krabat is glad. It is true, too. But the Marshal of Saxony, or whoever it may be sitting there behind him, the marshal tears a golden button off his coat. Put that in your gun now. Fire. Juro, the eagle, is only a few wing beats away now. Krabat has no intention of killing him. He pretends to be putting the golden button in the barrel of his rifle, but in fact he lets it slip from his hand. Fire, the marshal insists. Fire. Without turning his head, Krabat fires the gun over his left shoulder at their pursuer. It is blank, as he knows, loaded only with powder. No golden button in the barrel. There is the sudden crack of a shot and a shriek of agony. Krabat. Horrified, Krabat drops his gun. He covers his face with his hands and weeps. Krabat. Someone is calling in his ear. Krabat woke with a moan. How did he come to be sitting here at the table with Andrush and Pitar and Merton and all the others? They were staring at him, white, appalled, and each man looked away as soon as he felt Krabat's eyes on him. The master sat in his place, still as a corpse, leaning back in his chair, as if he were listening to something far away. Juro was motionless too, lying with the upper half of his body over the table, face down, his arms spread wide, arms that had been eagle's pinions beating strongly only a few moments ago. There was a spilled tankard beside him, and a dark red spot on the tabletop. Was it wine or blood? Laboche threw himself on Juro, sobbing. He's dead. He's dead. You killed him, Krabat. Feeling his gorge rise, Krabat tore his shirt open with both hands. Then he saw Juro move first one arm, then the other. Slowly, as it seemed, life was coming back into his body. Propping himself on his hands, Juro raised his face. There was a round red mark on his forehead, just above his nose. Juro. Little Laboche grasped his shoulders. You're alive, Juro. You're still alive. Why, what else? Inquired Juro. It was only done in play, but my head was fairly ringing with that shot of Krabat's. Someone else can play the part of this jerko another time. I've had enough. I'm off to bed." The miller's men laughed aloud in relief, and Andras said what they were all thinking. "Yes, you go to bed, brother. Thank heaven you're all right." Krabat sat at the table as if turned to stone. The shot, the scream, and now this light-hearted merriment all of a sudden. How did it all fit together? "Stop!" The master interrupted them harshly. "Stop it! I can't stand it. Sit down and be quiet." He had risen and was leaning one hand on the table. His other hand was clasped around his tankard as tightly as if he would crush it to pieces. "Yes," he cried, "what you saw was only a nightmare. You wake from a nightmare, and then, but I didn't dream the story of Jerko. That time when I was in Hungary, I did shoot him. I killed my friend. I had to kill my friend as Krabat did, as every man of you would have done in my place. Every single one." He brought his fist down on the table, making the tankards dance, reached for the jug of wine and drank from it greedily. Then he flung it at the wall, shouting, "Get out! All of you, get out of here! I want to be alone, alone, alone." Krabat wanted to be alone, too, and he slipped out of the mill. There was no moon that night, but there was starlight. He walked through the wet meadows to the mill pond, and when he looked down at the black water, from which the stars sparkled up at him, he felt a longing to bathe in it. Taking off his clothes, he slid into the pond and swam a few strokes out from the bank. The water was cold and cleared his head, which was what he needed after all that had happened that evening. He went under and surfaced again 12 times, and then, gasping and with chattering teeth, turned back to the bank. Juro was standing there with a blanket. "You'll catch cold, Krabat. Come on out. What are you doing?" He helped Krabat back on land, wrapped the blanket around him, and began to rub him dry. Krabat pulled away from him. "I don't understand it, Juro," he said. "I don't see how I could have shot at you." "You didn't shoot at me, Krabat, not with the golden button. You know that." "I know what would happen, I know." Juro nudged him in the ribs. "A shriek like that may sound nasty, but it's no great effort to produce one." "What about the mark on your forehead?" asked Krabat. "Oh, that," said Juro, smiling. "Don't forget, I know a little of the secret arts, just enough for my purposes." Chapter 10. A Ring of Hair. During the summer, Krabat had made use of his privilege of going out on Sundays a few times, less for his own amusement than to give the master no grounds for suspicion. Yet he could not get rid of his feeling that the miller was still planning to trick him. 3 weeks had gone by since he shot at Juro, and during that time, the master had hardly exchanged a word with Krabat. Then one evening he mentioned casually, as if it were nothing of importance, "I suppose you'll be off to Schwarzkolm next Sunday, eh?" "Schwarzkolm? Why?" asked Krabat. "There's a fair there next Sunday." "I'd have thought you'd want to go." "Oh, I'll see," said Krabat. "You know I don't much care for mixing with strangers when I don't have any of my friends with me." Later, he asked Juro what he ought to do. "Go, of course," said Juro. "What else?" "It's a lot to ask," said Krabat. "Well, there's a lot at stake," said Juro. "Besides, it would be a good chance for you to talk to the girl." Krabat was surprised. "You mean you know she lives in Schwarzkolm?" "I've known that ever since we sat by the Easter fire. It wasn't hard to guess." "Then you know who she is?" "No," said Juro, "and I don't want to know either." "No one can make me tell what I don't know. But if I meet her," said Krabat, "how can we keep it from the master?" "You know how to draw the magic circle," said Juro, and putting his hand in his pocket, he gave Krabat a piece of charcoal. "Take it, go, and meet your girl, and talk to her." Krabat went to bed early on Saturday. He wanted to be alone, to make up his mind whether to meet the singer from Schwarzkopf. Dare he tell her the whole story now? Recently, he had managed to win his struggles of willpower with Juro more and more often. Indeed, sometimes Juro would break out in a sweat first. Not that that was saying much. Juro remarked, and Krabat must not on any account make the mistake of underestimating the master. But on the whole, things looked quite hopeful. Krabat felt more confident every time he won. After all, Big Hat had defeated the miller. Why couldn't he do the same? He could rely on Juro's help, and on the girl from Schwarzkopf. But it was on this very point that Krabat was still in doubt. Ought he to involve the girl in his affairs? Who gave him any right to do so? Was his life worth the risk of hers? Krabat was undecided. He had to agree with Juro that it was a good chance to meet her. And who knew when he would get another? If only it were not for his uncertainty. Was he to tell her everything tomorrow, when he had not made up his own mind yet? Suppose I tell her most of it, he thought suddenly. Everything but the day and the hour of the test. He felt great relief. That will mean she needn't make a decision at once. And for me, it will mean a respite. I can wait and see how things go. I can wait until the very last moment, if need be. Krabat's fellow journeyman envied him when, after dinner on Sunday, he said the miller had given him the rest of the day off to go to the fair in Schwarzkopf. A fair, cried Lobosch. Just hearing the word makes me think I see huge plates of cakes before my eyes, and mountains of sweet pastries. Bring me home something nice to eat, do. Krabat was about to say, of course, but Lishko got in first and asked what Lobosch was thinking of. Do you suppose Krabat has nothing better to do in Schwarzkopf than think about cakes? No, said Lobosch. What better things are there to think about at a fair? He spoke with such deep feeling that everyone had to laugh. Krabat asked Juro for one of the napkins in which they carried food when they went out to work in the wood or at the peat cutting, folded it up and put it under his cap, saying, "Wait and see what there is for you, Lo." Bosh! He strolled out of the house, crossed the fen, and once on the other side of the wood, he took the path through the fields that led past Schwarzkopf. He drew the magic circle and sat down inside it, at the spot where he had met the girl on Easter morning. The sun was shining, and it was pleasantly warm for the time of year, good weather for a fair. Krabat looked across to the village. In the orchards, the fruit was already picked, but a dozen forgotten apples showed yellow and red among the withered leaves. He recited his spell in an undertone, directing all his thoughts toward the singer. There is someone sitting here in the grass, someone who wants to talk to you, he told her. Give him a little of your time. He promises it will not take long. No one must know where you are going or who you are meeting. He asks you that, and he hopes you can come. He knew he would have to wait for a while, and he lay down on his back, his arms folded behind his head, to think over what he was going to say to her again. The sky was a clear blue high above him, and as he gazed up at it, Krabat's eyelids grew heavy. When he woke, the girl was sitting on the grass beside him. At first he could not think what she was doing sitting there, patiently waiting, in her pleated Sunday skirt, a bright silk shawl printed with flowers around her shoulders, her hair covered by a lace-edged white linen cap. Have you been here long, singer? He asked. Why didn't you wake me? I have time to spare, she said, and I thought it would be best to let you sleep. He leaned up on his right elbow. It's a long time since we saw each other, he began. Yes, it is a long time. The girl pulled at the ends of her shawl. but you have sometimes been with me in my dreams. We were walking under some trees. Do you remember that?" Krabat laughed a little. "Yes, under the trees," said he. "It was summer, and the weather was warm, and you were wearing a light smock. I remember it as if it were yesterday." "And so do I." The singer nodded and turned to look at him. "Why did you want to talk to me?" "Why? I almost forgot," said Krabat. "Singer, if you wanted, you could save my life." "Save your life?" she asked. "Yes," said Krabat. "How?" "I can tell you quickly enough." Then he told her about the danger he was in and how she could help him, provided she could pick him out from the other ravens. "With your help, that ought not to be hard," said she. "Hard or not," Krabat warned her, "you must be quite clear that if you do not pass the test, you lose your own life." The girl did not hesitate for a moment. "I would willingly give my life for yours," she said. "When must I go to the miller to ask for your freedom?" "I'd rather not tell you that today," said Krabat. "Not yet. I will send you word when the time comes. I'll send a message by a friend if need be." He asked her to describe the house where she lived. She did so, and asked if he had a knife with him. "Here you are," said Krabat. He gave her Tonda's knife. The blade was black, as it always was these days, but it brightened again when the girl held it in her hands. She untied her cap and cut a lock of her hair, twisted it into a narrow ring, and gave it to Krabat. "This will be our token," said she. "If your friend brings it with him, I will be sure he comes from you." Krabat put the ring of hair into the pocket of his smock. "Now you must go back to Schwarzköln, and I'll follow you," he said. "And remember, we mustn't seem to know one another at the fair." "Does not know mean not dance together?" she asked. "Not exactly," said Krabat. "But not too often, you understand that?" "Yes, I understand." So saying, the girl rose to her feet, smoothed the pleats of her skirt, and went back to Schwarzköln, where the musicians were already striking up the music for the fair. There were tables and benches placed outside the village hall to form a square around the dancing floor, where the young people were already twirling around when Krabat arrived. The old folks sat sedately watching the girls and young men. The older men were smoking pipes, sitting with jugs of beer in front of them, and looking very insignificant in their blue or brown Sunday best beside the women, whose holiday costumes made them look like brightly feathered hens. The old women ate cakes and drank possets as they sat and gossiped about the young people dancing. Had their friends wondered who'd do as a husband for whom, and who wouldn't do at all? Had they heard that so-and-so and so-and-so were soon to marry? Though it looked as if it was all off between Bartosz's Franto and the smith's youngest daughter, the musicians were up on a platform by the house wall. 4 empty casks, upended, supported it, and it was made of the 2 halves of a barn door that the village mayor had brought along for the purpose. The musicians played music for the dancing on their fiddles and flutes, not to mention the deep bass viol, and if they once left off to wet their throats, as they might well do, there were protests. "Hey, you up there, are you here to play for us or to drink?" Krabat mixed with the young people of Schwarzköln and danced boisterously with all the girls at random, now with this one and now with that. He danced with the singer, too, from time to time, as he did with all the rest, though it was hard for him to let her go away and dance with other young men. She understood that they must not give themselves away, and they talked mere nonsense, as one does while dancing. Only her eyes spoke to Krabat, though no one noticed that but him, and because he noticed it, he avoided her glance when he could. So it was that even the peasant women sitting by had no suspicion, and the old woman who was blind in one eye, It was only now that Krabat saw her, was no exception. However, Krabat decided not to dance with the girl anymore after that. In any case, evening soon came. The farmers and their wives went home, and the young men and girls went off to the barn, along with the musicians, to carry on the dancing on the threshing floor. Krabat did not follow, thinking it wiser to go home now, back to the mill. She would understand. He raised his cap in farewell and felt something warm and soft on his head. Loboche, he suddenly remembered. He knotted the corners of the napkin together, and then he stuffed it full of cakes and pastries from the abandoned tables. Chapter 11. An Offer. As winter approached, it seemed to Krabat that time was passing more and more slowly. Indeed, after the middle of November, there were days when he had a feeling it was not passing at all. Sometimes, when there was no one near, he made sure he still had the ring of hair the singer had given him. As soon as he touched it in the pocket of his smock, he felt full of confidence. All will be well, he told himself. And somehow, he was sure of it. All will be well. The master had not often been away of late. Did he guess there was danger ahead? Did he suspect something was going on behind his back, and he must be on his guard? Krabat and Juro used the few available nights to go tirelessly on with their training of Krabat's willpower. And more often, Krabat managed to win their trials of strength. As they were sitting opposite one another at the kitchen table one evening, Krabat happened to take the ring of hair out of his pocket. Idly, he put it on the little finger of his left hand. When Juro gave his next order, Krabat did the opposite at once, and with astonishing speed and ease. "Why, your strength seemed to be doubled all of a sudden," said Juro. "How do you account for that?" "I have no idea," said Krabat. Perhaps it was chance." "Let's think." Juro looked searchingly at him. "There must be something that helped you." "But what?" Krabat wondered. "Can hardly have been the ring." "What ring?" asked Juro. "This ring of hair. She gave it me on the Sunday of the fair. I put it on just now. But what could the ring have to do with it?" "Don't say that," Juro said. "We'll try it, and then we'll know." They tried the ring, and soon found that there could be no doubt about it. When Krabat put it on his finger, he could master Juro's will easily, and when he took it off, everything was the same as usual. "That's quite clear," said Juro. "With the help of that ring, you're sure to beat the master." "I can't understand it," said Krabat. "Do you think she can work magic herself?" "Not the way we work magic," said Juro. "There's a kind of magic that must be learned with toil and difficulty, line by line, spell by spell, the magic of the book of necromancy. And then there's another kind that springs from the depths of the heart, from caring for someone and loving him. It's hard to understand, I know, but you had better trust that magic, Krabat." The next morning when Hanzo woke the miller's men and they went out to the pump, they saw that it had snowed overnight. The world around was all white, and once again the sight of the snow filled them with dread. Now Krabat knew why, indeed. There was only one person in the mill who could not understand it, and that was Loboche, who had not grown so very much larger since he came to the mill, yet was now a lad nearly 17 years old instead of a boy of 14. One morning, when Loboche threw a snowball at Andrush in play, Andrush flew at him, and Krabat stepped in to stop a fight. Loboche asked him what in heaven's name was the matter with them all. "They are afraid," said Krabat, shrugging his shoulders. "Afraid?" asked Loboche. "Afraid of what?" Krabat avoided a direct answer. "You'll learn soon enough." "What about you?" inquired Loboche. "You're not afraid, are you, Krabat?" "More than you guess," said Krabat. "And not for myself alone." It was the week before Christmas, when the goodman drove up to the mill in the fen, and the men ran out to unload the sacks. The stranger did not stay on the box as usual. On this night of new moon, he climbed down from the cart and went indoors with the master. He walked with a limp. They saw the feather of his hat flicker behind the window pane like a fire burning in the room. Hanzo had torches fetched, and the men unloaded the sacks from the cart in silence and carried them to the grinding room. They tipped whatever was in them into the hopper above the dead stones, let the meal they had ground run into the empty sacks, and loaded them back on the cart. At dawn, the stranger came back to his cart alone and climbed up on the box. But before he drove away, he turned to the miller's men. "Which of you is Krabat? Coals of fire and bitter cold in one." "I am," said Krabat, stepping forward. Suddenly he could hardly swallow. The driver of the cart looked him up and down and nodded. "Good," said he. Then he cracked his whip, and away he went with his cart. The miller shut himself up in the black room for 3 days and 3 nights. On the evening of the 4th day, the day before the Christmas season began, he summoned Krabat. "I have something to say to you," he said, "and I don't suppose it will come as much of a surprise. You are still free to choose for me or against me." Krabat tried to act as though he knew nothing. "I don't understand," he said. However, the master did not believe him. "Don't forget that I know you rather better than you may like," said he. "Many others have tried to set their will against mine over the years. Tonda, for example, and Michael, to name but 2. Fools, idiots. But you, now Krabat, I'd have thought you were wiser. If you want to be the miller here after me, you're the right man." "Why? Are you leaving?" asked Krabat. "I've been here long enough." The master loosened his collar. "I want to be my own master. In 2 or 3 years' time, you could take my place and teach the black school. If you agree to that, I will give you all I leave behind, including the book of necromancy." "And what will you do?" asked Krabat. "I'll go to court," said the master. "I'll be a statesman, a marshal, chancellor to the King of Poland. Depends how the fancy takes me. All the great lords will fear me, and the ladies will coax me to be their friend, because of my wealth and influence. All doors will be open to me. Everyone will want me to advise him. As for those who dare defy me, I'll crush them underfoot, for I can work magic. And believe me, Krabat, I know how to make use of my power." He had worked himself up into a frenzy. His one eye was burning, and the blood had risen to his face. "You can do the same," he went on, calmer now. "You can be master of this mill for 12 or 15 years, and then you can choose a successor from among your journeymen. Give him all that belongs here, and you will be free to live a life of glory and renown." Krabat tried to keep a clear head, forcing himself to remember Tonda and Michael. He had sworn to avenge them, Tonda and Michael, and the others buried out on the waste ground, not forgetting Vorshula and Merton. Merton, who might still be alive, with his wry neck. But what kind of a life was that he challenged the master? Tonda is dead, and Michael is dead, too. Who's to say that I'm not to be the next? I give you my word. The miller held out his left hand, my solemn word on it, and the word of the good man, too. He has explicitly given me leave to promise you that." Krabat did not take the offered hand. "If it's not me," he asked, "will it be someone else?" The master moved his hand as though to wipe something off the table. "It will always be someone," he said. "But from now on, we could get together to decide who it is to be. Someone who wouldn't be missed. Let's say Lishko, for example." I don't like Lishko, said Krabat, but he is one of my fellow journeymen, and am I to be guilty of his death? Or partly guilty, but I don't see much difference. No, Miller, you will never get me to consent to that. He had leapt to his feet, and now he shouted at the master, loathing in his voice, make whoever you like your successor here. I'll have no part in it. I'm going. The master kept calm. You will go when I permit you. Sit down and listen until I'm done. It was hard for Krabat to resist the temptation to try the strength of his own will against the master's then and there, however. He obeyed. I understand your feelings, said the miller. You're confused and surprised by my suggestion, so I'm giving you time to think it over at your leisure. Why? Asked Krabat. I'll still say no. The master looked at Krabat, shaking his head. For if you refuse my offer, you will have to die. You know there is a coffin standing ready in the shed. Ah, but whose coffin? Said Krabat. That we have yet to see. The master did not move a muscle. Do you know what it would mean if things turned out as you seem to hope they will? Yes, said Krabat. I could work no more magic. Well, the master asked, would you be content for that to happen? He seemed to be thinking for a moment, and then leaned back in his chair. Well, said he, I'll give you 8 days' grace. In that time, you'll have the chance to learn what life is like when you can work no more magic. I'll take care of that. All you've learned from me over the years from this moment, it will be gone, forgotten. And when the week is up, on the day before New Year's Eve, I'll ask you for the last time whether you want to take my place. Then we'll see if your answer is still the same. Chapter 12. Between the Years. It was a hard week for Krabat. He felt as if he were back in his early days at the mill. Every sack weighed as heavy as it really was, and it had to be carried from granary to grinding room and back to the meal store. Krabat was spared nothing, now that he could not work magic. Not a drop of sweat, not a sore place on his skin. Every evening he sank on his bed exhausted, but he could not sleep for hours. When you can work magic, you have only to close your eyes and recite a spell, and you are asleep at once, fast asleep, for as long as you wish. It may be that I'm going to miss that worst of all, thought Krabat. When he finally did fall asleep after lying awake so long, he was tormented by nightmares, and he knew they did not come by chance. He could easily work out who was sending him such dreams. Dressed in rags, Krabat is struggling with a cart of stones, pulling it over the fields on the end of a rope. It is hard work in hot summer weather. He is thirsty, his throat dry as a bone, and there is not a spring of water in sight, nor a tree to give him shade. The devil take that cart. He is taking it to Blashk, the cattle dealer of Kamenz, and he is working for a mere pittance. But a man must live on something, and ever since his accident that was in Gerbesdorf, when he was caught in the machinery of the mill, and it crushed his right arm to the elbow ever since then, Krabat must be glad of any work that comes his way. So he drags himself along with the cart of stones, and he thinks he hears, or else he hears himself thinking it. He thinks he hears the master's hoarse voice saying, "How do you like life now? You're a cripple, Krabat. You might have been better off if you'd listened to me when I asked if you wanted to take my place at the mill in the fen. If you had the choice again today, would you still say no?" Night after night, Krabat dreamed that some such fate had overtaken him. He was old or sick. He was in prison, though innocent of any crime. He had been pressed into the army, and he lay wounded to death in a wheat field, watching the crushed blades of wheat run red with the blood from his wounds. And at the end of these dreams, he would always hear the master's voice asking him, "Would you still say no, Krabat, if I gave you the same choice today?" Only once did the master himself actually appear in his dreams, and that was on the last night before his week's grace ran out. To help Juro, Krabat has turned himself into a horse. The master, dressed as a Polish nobleman, has bought him in Wittichino market for 100 guilders, along with his saddle and the halter. The horse is handed over to him. The master rides him pitilessly over the moor, over sticks and stones, over hedges and ditches, through thorns and mire. Remember that I am your master. The miller brings the whip down on him, driving the spurs into his flanks. Blood is flowing from them. He feels it run warm down the inside of his thighs. I'll teach you. A gallop to the left, a gallop to the right, then on to the next village, a tug at the reins, and they stop outside a smithy. Hey there, Smith. Where the devil are you hiding? The smith comes running up to ask what the gentleman wants, wiping his hands on his leather apron. The master swings himself out of the saddle. Shoe me this horse, and shoe him with red-hot iron, says he. The smith cannot believe his ears. With red-hot iron, sir? Must I tell you everything twice? I'll teach you to work fasten. Barteau. The smith calls for his apprentice. Take the reins and hold this gentleman's horse. The smith's apprentice is a freckled urchin who might be Lowbush's brother. And take the heaviest shoes you have, the miller tells him. Show me your stock. The smith leads him into the forge while the boy holds the horse, talking to him in Wendish. Quiet then, old horse. Quiet. Now. Why, you're all of a tremble. Krabat rubs his head against the boy's shoulder. If I were free of the halter, he thinks, I could try to save myself. The boy sees that the horse is hurt. The leather strap has rubbed a sore place by his left ear. Just a minute, says he. I'd best loosen the buckle a bit. It won't take a moment. He loosens the buckle and pulls the halter off over the horse's head. Soon as he is rid of it, Krabat turns into a raven. Croaking, he rises in the air and makes for Schwarzkolm. The sun is shining in the village of Schwarzkolm, and below him he sees the singer standing near the well, a straw basket in her hand, feeding the chickens, when a shadow passes over him, and he hears the cry of a hawk in his ear. The master, Krabat thinks at once. Swift as an arrow, wings spread, Krabat swoops down into the well, where he changes into a fish. Will he be safe now? Too late. Too late he realizes that he is trapped. There is no way out of the well. Singer, he thinks, directing all the power of his mind at her. Help me out of this, well. The girl dips her hand into the well. Krabat becomes a narrow gold ring on her finger, and so he comes back into the world above. Suddenly, there is a nobleman dressed in Polish clothes standing by the well. He has only one eye, and he wears a red riding coat with silver lacing and black galloons. Can you tell me where you got that pretty ring, young woman? Let me see it. He's stretching out his hand, reaching for the ring. Krabat turns into a grain of barley, slips from the girl's finger and falls into the basket. As she scatters the next handful, she throws him among the chickens. And suddenly, the man in the red coat is gone. There is a strange rooster, black as coal, with only one eye, pecking at the corn, but Krabat is faster. Seizing his advantage, he turns into a fox. Quick as a flash, he falls on the black rooster and bites through his neck. There is a crackle of chaff and straw between his teeth. Nothing but chaff and straw. When Krabat woke, he was bathed in sweat. He found that he had bitten into his straw mattress and was gasping for breath. It was some time before his heart stopped thudding. He took his defeat of the master in his dream as a good omen, and now he felt sure he would win, and the master's days were numbered. He, Krabat, would put an end to the miller's evil deeds. He was the man appointed to break the master's power. That evening he went to the master's room. "My answer is still the same," he said. "Make whoever you like your successor. As for me, I refuse your offer." The master heard him out quietly. "Go to the woodshed," said he, "and get yourself a spade and pick. There's a grave to be dug out in the fen that will be your last task." Without replying, Krabat turned and left the room. When he reached the shed, a figure emerged from the shadows. "I've been waiting for you, Krabat. Am I to take word to her?" Krabat took the ring of hair from the pocket of his smock. "Tell her you carry a message from me," he said. "Tell her that tomorrow, on the last evening of the year, she may go to the miller and ask for my freedom, as we arranged." And he described her house to Juro. "If you show her the ring," he went on, "she will know that you come from me. But don't forget to tell her she is free to come to the mill or not to come. If she comes, that is good, and if she doesn't come, it is good too, since I won't mind what happens to me then." He gave Juro the ring, embracing him. "Promise to do as I say. You won't persuade her to do anything she doesn't really want to do." "I promise," said Juro. And a raven with a ring of hair in its beak set off on its flight to Schwarzcombe. Krabat went into the shed. Was that the coffin standing in the corner? He shouldered his pick and spade and trudged through the snow, out into the fen until he came to the waste ground. He found a place where a dark rectangle stood out in the white snow. Was it meant for him, or did it mark the master's grave? "About this time tomorrow," thought Krabat, driving his spade into the ground. "About this time tomorrow we will know." The next day, after breakfast, Juro took his friend aside and gave back the ring, telling him he had talked to the girl, and it was all settled. That evening, at dusk, the girl from Schwarzcombe came to the mill wearing her communion dress, with the white band around her forehead. Hanzo opened the door to her and asked what she wanted, and she asked to speak to the miller. "I am the miller." Thrusting his men aside, the master came out to meet her. He had on his black coat and three-cornered hat, and he was pale, pale as death. "What do you want?" he asked. The girl looked steadily at him. "I want my young man," said she. "Your young man?" The miller laughed, an evil bleating sound like a billy goat laughing. "I don't know your young man." "His name is Krabat," said the girl, "and I love him." Krabat. Now the master was trying to bully her. "Why, young woman? Do you even know the man? Could you pick him out from among my other journeymen?" "Yes, I know him," said the singer. "Anyone can say that." The master turned to his men. "Go into the black room and stand in a row, side by side, and don't move." Krabat expected that they would have to turn into ravens now. He was placed between Andrush and Stashko. "Stay where you are, and don't any of you make a move." "Not you either, Krabat," said the master. "At the first sound I hear you make, she dies." He took a black cloth from his coat pocket and bound it around the girl's eyes. Then he let her in. "If you can show me which is your young man, you may take him away with you." Krabat was horrified. He had not expected this. How was he to help her? Even the ring of hair was no use now. The girl walked up and down the row of the miller's men, once, twice. Krabat could hardly stand upright. He felt that his life was lost, and hers too. He was overwhelmed by such fear as he had never felt before. She will die, and it's my doing, he kept thinking. My doing. Then the singer, who had walked up and down the row of journeymen 3 times, put out her hand and pointed to Krabat. "This is the man," she said. Are you sure? Yes, she said, I am sure. And with that, it was all over. She untied the cloth from her eyes and went up to Krabat. You are free, she said. The master staggered back and leaned against the wall while the men stood where they were, as if turned to stone. Fetch your things from the attic, all of you, and be off with you to Schwarzkopf, said Juro. You can spend the night in the loft of the village hall. The miller's men came back to life and crept out of the black room. The master, they all knew, would not live to see New Year's Day. At midnight, he must die, and the mill would go up in flames. Merton, with his wry neck, pressed Krabat's hand warmly. You've avenged Tonda and Michael and all the others, too. Krabat was dumb, unable to say a word, but the girl put her arm around his shoulders and wrapped him in her shawl of wool. It was warm, soft, and warm, like a cloak of safety around him. Let us go, Krabat. He let her lead him out of the mill and through the fen, away to Schwarzkopf. At last, when they saw the lights of the village flicker out between the tree trunks, one by one, he asked her, How did you pick me out from the others? I could feel that you were afraid, she said. You were afraid for me. And that was how I knew you. As they walked toward the houses of the village, snow began to fall. Very gently, fine flakes of snow like flour falling on them from some great sieve.